The footage you're seeing was taken from a South Korean news helicopter in 1998, and what happens immediately after this is absolutely wild. Prior to this video recording, a gas leak caused a fire to break out at an LPG station, and it was only a matter of time until it found an ignition source. This helicopter actually just happened to be flying by the area, too, so when someone on board noticed, they turned their cameras on. I'll tell you everything, but as usual, let's get into the backstories first. The story begins on September 11th, 1998, in an industrial South Korean city called Bucheon, which is about 25 kilometers from Seoul. This densely populated area was home to countless families and businesses going about their ordinary routines, and this Friday afternoon had the usual energy you'd see at the end of a work week. At a combined liquefied petroleum gas filling station, or LPG, customers came and went, vehicles lined up for fuel, and workers handled the daily operations that helped keep the city running. And at around 2 p.m., a tank truck arrived to deliver butane to the station's underground storage tank, a routine procedure performed thousands of times across the country every single day. However, the required safety management officer was not present at the facility, and this is important because, with no one supervising the operation, the driver made a decision that would prove catastrophic. He entered the office to rest, leaving the transfer to continue completely unattended while he did so. What he didn't realize was that both the gas line and liquid line couplings had been improperly connected, and butane was now leaking at a pretty alarming rate into the air. And by just 2:06 p.m., people in the area began to notice. This invisible gas had been pouring out for several minutes, accumulating across the station grounds and spreading into the surrounding area. They would have, of course, started smelling this. Nearly 5 tons of highly flammable butane would ultimately escape in Bucheon over the next 20 minutes, creating a continually expanding cloud of danger that enveloped everything nearby. And at 2:10 p.m., all this leaked gas found an ignition source. Investigators would later determine it was likely a spark from a vehicle that had just finished refueling and was starting its engine. The butane ignited instantly and flames erupted across the station. After this explosion, emergency calls flooded into the local fire station as residents watched in horror from nearby streets and buildings. Within 10 minutes, over 1,200 emergency responders were mobilizing across the city. Firefighters, police officers, soldiers, and civil servants raced towards the burning station with 90 fire trucks and multiple helicopters that eventually dropped foam and water on the site. Despite this, it was a pretty tricky and very dangerous situation. The fire burned so intensely that firefighters couldn't get close enough to fight it effectively. And the flames were now heating 2 parked tank trucks, one containing propane and one containing butane, along with the thousands of household gas cylinders stored at the facility that were already exploding at different points. All of these tanks were being transformed into bombs by the relentless heat, and evacuation orders were being sent out. This was very dire. And this would continue on for a bit longer, when suddenly, this happens. At 2:23 p.m., the propane truck exploded in what's known as a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, or BLEVE, one of the most devastating types of industrial accidents. And also, by remarkable coincidence, the footage we just watched was captured by a television helicopter from the Korean broadcasting system that just happened to be passing through the area. Of course, once they saw this, they started focusing on it, eventually having to perform emergency evasive maneuvers to avoid being caught in the blast. At the point that this was taken, they were about 2.5 miles from the explosion. Approximately 60 people were injured in that single moment, with many suffering burns as they ran from the advancing flames, and others hurt by falling debris or just the sheer force of the blast wave that shattered windows and knocked them over. Nonetheless, the evacuation orders did help immensely here in what could have been much worse, but stay with me because this ordeal was not over yet. Just minutes later, between 2:24 and 2:27 in the afternoon, the underground butane storage tank also ruptured in a third explosion. Another fireball erupted, hurling the heavy storage tank more than 200 feet from its original position and causing the station floor to collapse entirely. Buildings that had survived the first and second blasts were now engulfed in flames, and 4 firefighters were among those seriously injured as they fought desperately to contain the spreading destruction. After this, more small household gas cylinders continued to explode throughout the afternoon, sort of like fireworks, and the fire was so intense that it would burn until nighttime before finally being extinguished. When the smoke cleared and investigators could finally assess the devastation, the toll was bad, but again, it could have been way worse. Despite the intensity of the footage we just watched, only 1 person passed away. Of course, any loss of life is still tragic, but at this scale and watching this footage, we all understand how much worse things could have been. And still, you have to remember 96 people were injured and 11 were very seriously injured. 12 buildings were destroyed or severely damaged, and 18 vehicles were incinerated at the station alone. This ordeal resulted in around $13 million in property damage. And in just less than an hour, this entire city block had been transformed into a disaster zone. The official investigation by South Korea's Gas Safety Corporation determined that faulty coupling connections on the transfer hoses, both gas and liquid lines, had caused the initial leak, as I previously mentioned, but this was notably compounded by the absence of required safety supervision and the driver's decision to leave the operation unmonitored, which I also already mentioned, but I figured I'd mention again. The thing too is that this explosion was a bit more than just an isolated tragic incident. It actually occurred during one of the darker periods in South Korean industrial safety history, for lack of a better term. Through the 90s, there were a series of devastating disasters that killed hundreds and exposed many systematic failures in a nation that, at the time, had prioritized rapid economic growth over anything else, at least over safety. Some of these you may very well have heard of, too. There was a bridge collapse, a subway construction gas explosion that killed 101 people, including 42 middle school students, and a department store collapse that killed 502. I'm pretty sure I saw Fascinating Horror cover this a few years ago. Great channel. These happened before this gas station disaster, and so this just makes you look at it in a bit of a different light. These catastrophes eventually forced South Korea to confront uncomfortable truths about corruption and inadequate enforcement, though it's a shame it had to go so far first. In the aftermath, stricter safety measures were implemented at gas station facilities nationwide, and supervision requirements were enhanced. This dramatic television footage became an international case study, teaching firefighters and safety engineers worldwide about the devastating physics of BLEVEs. And if you were around during this time, you might actually remember it. It was featured in a bunch of TV series and stuff. Nonetheless, for South Korea, this disaster became another painful lesson and reminder that no amount of economic progress justifies the preventable loss of even a single life, and the seemingly routine operations that we take for granted every day do demand unwavering attention to safety and detail. We really do take a lot of these things for granted, as they are often functionally transparent, but the more I make these videos, the more I start noticing them and the amazing people who work day in, day out to follow them. This is a case with a lot of technology, but safety to me, it's paramount. This one's pretty crazy. It was recommended to me in my Discord by a viewer named Asa, and unfortunately we don't know all too much about the victims of the story, Franz and Theresia Kraus, but we do know that for years they lived quietly in their home in Albany, New York. According to their son Lorenz, they were aging immigrants who had come to America from Europe decades earlier after experiencing the devastation of World War II. Franz purportedly even spent years in a Soviet prisoner of war camp. By 2017, the two were obviously getting up there in age, and so their 40-something-year-old son, Lorenz, stepped in to help. And we'll get back to this, but let me tell you a bit about their son, Lorenz Kraus, first. Franz and Theresia's son had taken a pretty unconventional path in life. He held a political science degree from Siena College, where he was a valedictorian, and had earned an MBA from RPI in 2009. He later described himself as self-employed and married, and in 2017 moved in with his parents to start looking after them. In 2020, Lorenz ran a fringe presidential campaign in New Hampshire and claimed he wanted to break the country up into 4 different areas. Quote, to break the control of the deep state, British agents, Rhodes scholars, and Jewish people. And his real-life neighbors called him a recluse. Anyways, as you may have pieced together, this campaign went nowhere, but we're going to go back to 2017 now because it's an important year for the story, but I just had to mention that. Strange guy. In the summer of 2017, neighbors began to notice that they just never saw Franz and Theresia anymore. When they asked Lorenz about them, he kept insisting his parents had moved to Germany. To them, this seemed plausible enough. Elderly immigrants often dream of returning to their homeland or somewhere close to it, but something just seemed off about this. Nothing really ended up coming of it though. Over the following months and years, Lorenz continued to maintain the property. He mowed the lawn regularly, shoveled snow in the winter, and kept the front yard in order. He collected the mail, and to all outward appearances, he came off simply as a son caring for his parents' home. Clearly, they had just moved back to Europe. Neighbors forgot, things moved on, and the story held for 8 years. But in May of 2025, the Social Security Administration contacted Albany police with a concern. They had been unable to reach Franz and Theresia Kraus for several years. More than $52,000 in Social Security checks had been cashed in their name, but they couldn't actually get a hold of them. This understandably triggered a financial crimes investigation, and on September 23, 2025, police executed a search warrant at the home. And the following evening, on September 24th, excavation equipment arrived in the backyard. A coroner was called to the scene as human remains were found and removed from the property. The next morning, on September 25th, a second body was discovered. And then, on that same afternoon, in a bizarre move, Lorenz Kraus contacted multiple media outlets via email. He sent a 2-page statement, his phone number, and a selfie. A CBS 6 news director called to verify his identity, and when asked directly if he had killed his parents, Kraus initially said, "I plead the fifth." But he did agree to an in-person interview when the news director promised to post his statement online. And within an hour, Lorenz Kraus arrived at the CBS 6 studios location. A police officer in plain clothing waited in the front lobby, and someone else patted Lorenz down. Anchor Greg Floyd, a veteran journalist with 45 years of experience and 6 Emmy Awards, had just 10 minutes to prepare for this. The 30-minute interview that followed required persistent questioning. Floyd had to circle back repeatedly, asking direct questions like, "Did you kill them?" And Lorenz Kraus pretty quickly confessed to the killings in a news interview, providing detailed answers. He said the deaths occurred on a cool August night in 2017. He claimed he strangled his father Franz with his bare hands first, and after Franz died, his mother Theresia, quote, put her head on his chest and she was there for a few hours. Then Kraus said, "I finished her." When Floyd asked the question, "When your parents died, did they know what was happening to them?" Kraus replied, "Yes, and it was so quick."
Did you kill your parents to put them out of their misery?
My concern for their misery was paramount. It was a huge burden to...
So you alleviated that burden?
You're a good questioner. I have to protect my Fifth Amendment rights on this.
They realized what you were doing to them as it happened.
Yes.
They knew that this was it for them, that they were perishing at your hand.
Yes. And it was so quick.
What was going through your head?
Not thoughts, action.
When pressed on whether his parents had explicitly asked to be killed, Kraus admitted they had not. He said they didn't explicitly say it, but they made it clear that they were going downhill. His logic for doing this was basically that he would rather that happen to them than them pass at a hospital or something like that. Lorenz said they remained in the house for several days before he buried them in the backyard, and for 8 years, he had collected their Social Security benefits. As mentioned, more than $52,000 in total. The interview was quickly posted, and as Lorenz Kraus left the building, Albany police arrested him in the parking lot. And I just want to say, this is probably up there with the most unusual interviews I've ever seen. Many people think that Greg Floyd dug way too deep with the questions, but it is important to note that he had little time to prepare. But yeah, this could have been intentional, and either way, I just think the entire thing is unusual. The dynamic, the extremely weird behavior from Lorenz, and the fact that neither of them were wearing socks. It's 30 minutes long, and I'm trying to keep these segments tight, so I'm not going to show you it all, but if you have some downtime, you should go check this out. Kraus was arraigned one day later on September 26th of 2025. An assistant public defender entered a not guilty plea on his behalf, despite the extremely detailed confession he just made on television. He was remanded without bail, and on October 1st, a month prior to me scripting this, a grand jury returned a 7-count indictment, 1 count of first-degree murder, 2 counts of second-degree murder, 2 counts of concealment of a human corpse, second-degree larceny, and first-degree identity theft. At his October 6th arraignment, Kraus pleaded not guilty to all charges, and by late October, prosecutors declared they were ready for trial. The central legal battle will be over whether the televised confession is admissible as evidence. His defender has argued that the interview looked like a police interrogation and raised concerns about whether the media acted as an agent of the police. Legal experts predict the defense will file a motion to suppress the confession, arguing it occurred without legal representation and potentially required Miranda warnings. If the confession is suppressed, prosecutors will need to rely on forensic evidence. Yet as of late October 2025, the remains have not been officially identified by the medical examiner, and no official cause of death has been issued. Finding jurors unfamiliar with the case will be difficult, as this was huge in the area and even popped off quite a bit outside of Albany, and Krause faces life without parole if convicted. Either way, it appears that 2 innocent elderly people passed away in their home in 2017 at the hands of their own son, and for 8 years he told neighbors that they had simply moved to Germany, all while collecting their government benefits and maintaining their property as if nothing happened. I think we can come to our own conclusions. Rest in peace to these poor people. If you're enjoying this video, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. It's cool if not, but I spend at least 10 hours on these documentaries every single day, and I don't take sponsorships or anything, usually, so it'd really help. In the summer of 1976, the Caribbean was seeing an escalation of violence that few outside the region fully understood. Throughout June, July, and August of that year, a series of attacks unfolded across multiple countries. There were airline offices bombed in Barbados, Colombia, and Costa Rica, Cuban embassies attacked with machine guns, and diplomats assassinated in Mexico and Argentina. Behind these coordinated strikes was a newly formed umbrella organization called the Coordination of United Revolutionary Organizations, known by its Spanish acronym, CORU. It brought together 5 militant Cuban exile groups united in their opposition to Fidel Castro's government. The group's founders, Luis Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch, had gathered in the Dominican Republic to formalize their alliance on June 11th of 1976. And following this, the attacks really picked up, creating an even worse atmosphere of tension across the region. According to a CIA intelligence report that would be declassified decades later, yes, we're already bringing up the CIA, they possessed intelligence as early as June of 1976 about plans by CORU to target a Cubana commercial airliner. No warning reached Cuban authorities, and just 1 month later, in July of 1976, officials in Jamaica discovered a suitcase bomb intended for a Cubana flight before it could be loaded onto an aircraft. This one, fortunately, was intercepted, but a few months later, 70+ passengers would not be so lucky. On October 6, 1976, Cuba's national fencing team, consisting of 24 young athletes, most of whum were still teenagers, boarded Cubana Flight 455 in Georgetown, Guyana, exhausted but still elated. They were on their way back from Venezuela after sweeping every gold medal at the Central American and Caribbean Championships, and they were pretty excited to get back home, where Cubans as a whole and state media were celebrating them. Joining them on this flight were 11 Guyanese passengers, including 5 medical students heading to Cuba for their studies, and a 9-year-old girl named Sabrina, the youngest person aboard. Additionally, 5 North Korean officials, the flight crew, and dozens of other Cuban citizens filled the remaining seats of the Douglas DC-8. The flight would make a few routine stops, first to Trinidad, then Barbados, then Jamaica, before the final leg home to Havana. During the Trinidad to Barbados segment, 2 Venezuelan men boarded briefly and their luggage was checked through to Havana. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. When the plane landed in Barbados, the 2 men deplaned. Some of their items, however, continued on with the 73 people still on board, and you can probably see where this is going. At 5:15 p.m., Flight 455 departed Barbados and climbed toward cruising altitude. And just 11 minutes later, at 18,000 feet, an explosion ripped through the rear of the aircraft. The captain radioed immediately.
Cubana 455. Cubana 455, you we had an explosion and we are descending immediately. We had fire on board. Cubana 455, okay, Silver, Cubana 455. We are requesting immediately landing. Cubana 455, you are clear to land.
While everything was happening, the pilots fought to control the burning plane while simultaneously attempting to return to Barbados. But then a second blast tore through the midsection, severing control systems. And it does seem that we can hear both of the blasts in this recording. The first one at the very, very beginning. I don't know if anyone noticed that. And then the second one a bit later into it. The remainder of the recording is mostly just the same thing. I'm just not going to show the very last moments out of respect. In the cockpit voice recorder's final seconds, the co-pilot can be heard saying, "Head toward the water." The captain, realizing he couldn't reach proper land, made one last heroic decision when he steered away from Barbados' crowded beaches toward the open sea, and the aircraft plunged into the water. All 73 people passed away on impact. Only a small number of the deceased were recovered, with the rest being lost to the ocean. Within 24 hours, Trinidad police arrested the two bombers at a Port of Spain hotel. Both men confessed, and they described in detail how they planted 2 time bombs on the Trinidad-Barbados leg. One was hidden inside a camera placed under a seat, and another was concealed in a Colgate toothpaste tube filled with C4 explosive and left in the restroom. They explained that they were paid $25,000 for the job, and they named the men who hired them: Luis Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch, the 2 anti-Castro Cuban exiles operating in Venezuela who founded CORU. And on October 14th, Venezuelan police arrested them as well, finding weapons and explosive at Posada's detective agency. The evidence here was overwhelming. The perpetrators had confessed, named their employers, and authorities had them in custody within days. And I'm just going to say it if you were wondering, yes, there was US involvement here. But what emerged in later decades, particularly after documents were declassified in 2005, was the actual depth of US intelligence involvement. For one, Luis was a CIA operative in the 1960s. We have declassified documents that prove this. He was trained in explosives and sabotage at Fort Benning, Georgia. CIA files, which I have all of, gave him 3 different code names and documented payments of roughly $300 a month. In a 1998 New York Times interview, Posada himself stated, "The CIA taught us everything: explosives, how to kill, bomb, and trained us in acts of sabotage." More troubling is that declassified documents showed the CIA maintained contact with Posada until June of 1976, 4 months before the attack, and possessed some advanced intelligence that CORU planned to bomb a commercial Cuban airliner. But this intelligence didn't reach the headquarters until after the plane went down. How convenient. Orlando Bosch had his own CIA connections from the Bay of Pigs era as well, and the 2 bombers worked for Posada's agency and initially told Trinidad police that they were, quote, paid CIA members, though they later recanted. FBI reports to Secretary of State Kissinger noted that an FBI agent had given one of the bombers a US visa just 5 days before the attack, despite suspecting that he worked for Posada in terrorist activities. And really, justice just never came. After trials spanning years, the 2 bombers served 17 years in a Venezuelan prison, but Bosch was acquitted on a technicality and Posada escaped custody in 1985 and fled. Both masterminds eventually made their way to the US, where they lived openly in Miami despite international arrest warrants and extradition requests from Venezuela and Cuba. In 1990, President George H.W. Bush granted Bosch an administrative pardon at the request of his son, Jeb Bush, overriding objections from the Justice Department, who insisted that for 30 years Bosch had been resolute and unwavering in his advocacy of terrorist violence, and that he was one of the most deadly terrorists working within the hemisphere. When Posada illegally entered the United States in 2005, the government declined Venezuela's extradition request, with an immigration judge ruling that he faced potential torture if he returned, a protection the US notably did not extend to terrorism suspects it rendered to other countries in other cases. Posada was tried in Texas in 2011, but only for perjury and immigration fraud, not terrorism. He was acquitted. Orlando Bosch died as a free man in Miami on April 27, 2011, and was celebrated as a hero by segments of the Cuban exile community. Posada died on May 23, 2018, also in Miami, also free, at age 90. The bombing remains the first successful mid-air attack on a civilian airliner in the Western Hemisphere, and a wound that has never healed for the Caribbean nations that lost their citizens on that day. Rest in peace to all of the innocent people who lost their lives in this horrifying disaster, and if you are interested in reading any of the declassified documents, they're linked in my source list below. But just a heads up, this list might spoil some of the other entries. And I'm just adding this in because I saw it after I finished the entry. Apparently there was a bus with 73 dogs on board that went off a cliff when the driver got carried away watching this plane crash. This is pretty loosely reported, but it was told to the FBI, and yeah, none of them made it through, which is also terrible. Thank you guys so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. I've been working so hard on these videos recently. As I said, it's usually 10 to 12 hours a day at least. I take the odd day off. You don't have to worry about me or anything like that. But yeah, thank you for being here. I'm going to aim to try and make the videos longer. I can't guarantee anything, but that's going to be my goal going forward. Not too much longer, just like high 30s, early 40s range. I've already got a head start on the next video, so I'll see you guys again Sunday or Monday.